I assembled the model in quite a few components to make painting and weathering just a bit easier. But I made sure that once I glue them on the model, it won't create any problems. I'll be able to work with it separately like this and then bring things together later on in an efficient manner. I primed the model in black spray primer, but it was a bit splotchy. I didn't want to get it too thick, so to make sure everything was covered equally, I grabbed some Vallejo model color dark gray, thinned it down about 50-50 with water, and just went over all the parts and made sure everything had a good coat of this color so that it established a solid foundation. Everything that was going to be coming after this for the bulk of the model would be gray, so this would be an appropriate color for that. It also made sure that I didn't have to fight too hard to cover up that black primer. Because the paint was fairly thin, I did put on 2 thin coats, but that made sure that everything was nice and smooth. I didn't want a lot of texture or brush marks or anything like this for the model. Once I gave that color time to dry, I switched over to Citadel's Mechanica Standard Gray, and this I thinned down quite a bit more, 2 parts water, 1 part paint. And I used the same big filbert brush to begin applying this. And I did this in a much more splotchy, scratchy, distressed kind of way because I wanted to establish a foundation of the darker gray paint that would just not look completely smooth. I didn't want brush type texture, visceral texture that you could feel, but I did want the paint to look a bit distressed, a bit worn, and doing it with this method really helps to get that kind of application. You do have to do several coats, but it dries really smooth and goes on really quick. And while an airbrush would have been faster, I just couldn't have achieved this same effect with the airbrush. Now what I do as I'm applying it is I get a little on my brush and then I damp off just a little on a paper towel so that I don't go right in with a fully loaded brush, but rather it's, I guess if I had to classify it, I'd call it a half-loaded brush. It only took a few minutes to work my way around all of the parts of the model, and by the time I got to the last section of parts, I went back to the first parts that I did, and those were already dry. It dried very quickly, and so I began with a second coat. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm again applying it in a very splotchy manner. I'm okay with some of the darker background colors shining through because I want that distressed look. I want that used, worn look. This is the basis of the weathering that's to come later. But I also know that I can build up the opacity as I go. This method works just fine for building up full opacity paint. It just gives you a very smooth application with a brush that won't be quite as smooth as you can get with an airbrush, but it will still be very, very smooth. And while it does take a few coats, it's not too bad. In the end, I did about 3 coats of this, maybe a touch of a 4th coat here and there on a few parts, and got it to the opacity and the look that I wanted to get it ready for the next step. And it didn't take too long. I think total time I spent about 30 minutes, and I think if I would not have been pausing to move the camera now and then and focus and things like that, then it would have gone quite a bit faster. The key really is just keeping that paint thin and making sure that it goes on in very, very loose, thin coats. And don't worry about the bubbles. As it dries, they will pop and they will go away, and it'll leave you a nice coat of paint on there. I wanted to continue the paint distressing, and I used this mix of Citadel's Eshin Gray and Dawn Stone. It's about a 50-50 mix of the paint, and then I thinned it down with an equal amount of water. This I'm applying with a sponge, and I'm doing this kind of like I would do chipping, but much heavier, and with an idea of that it's more about distressing the paint and lightening up a lot of the surfaces. Now I'm going to go over all of the surfaces with this color, and it's just going to continue to change the tone of the model, give it some tonal variety, just building in some weathering. There's going to be more weathering that goes over the top of this, of course, but this just really starts that process. Now, if you're doing a method like this and you get a little too much paint in one area, then just flip the sponge around to a dry part of it, soak up that paint, and just keep going. It's a very controllable method and a very easy method to do. You can see the effect that gives. It just gives a very worn, distressed look. And you can carry this as far as you want and use as many different colors. Because I'm working with grays, it's in a very narrow band of color, but it looks kind of cool, I think, and just ends up looking much more, I think, realistic. It sells to the brain that this is a used piece of military equipment that's seen some action. Now this next application is going to be just pure Dawn Stone from Citadel. I had trouble saying that, Dawn Stone from Citadel. And I've again thinned this with water. It's about 1 part paint, 1 part water. So it's fairly thin. Now this I'm going to be putting in just forward-facing areas that are going to receive light. It's not zenithal, it's not modulation, it's something kind of in between those, but it's just going to try and bring out the volumes on that curved armor up on the front. That's my goal here, is to bring out that shape a little more and just lighten it up just a bit to simulate some light. Now, I'll put this same paint over a few other areas on the front, on the legs, especially the surfaces on the legs that seem like they would get more light on them. But it's a very simple way to control your light effects and get a very interesting finish that's consistent with itself. Of course, you could continue applying layers of this to further lighten up areas and even add additional paints into it to make it even lighter. Once that's dry, you can see the effect that it has. Here's just a quick dry fit so I could just look at the lighting effects and see if I liked it. But you see it just highlights the front of that armor, and then there's a little bit of a gradient going back to the darker areas in the back and on the lower part of it. And it will just be something that I will continue to enhance as the build goes along, accentuating that front of the armor. And there's a little bit of the lighter color on the legs, especially on that forward leg and on the back of the leg that's stepping out. I wanted to do some edge highlighting on the model, but I didn't think the traditional painted on edge highlights would work well with this type of finish. I just thought it would be a little too sharp in contrast to the scratchy, rough finish that I had laid down before this. So I thought dry brushing would be a little more appropriate. So I just used this small Artist Opus dry brush and some Citadel Celestra gray and just went in around the model, highlighting the edges and the bolts and things like that. I actually did 2 passes around the model just to build it up where I thought it needed to be. Now, of course, you can always go back with a brush and enhance any areas that you think need a little more emphasis, or if you want to add some color to all the bolt detail just to make those stand out a little more. Next, I wanted to add in some metallic colors to the parts of the frame that you could see exposed around the model. And so I used Citadel Iron Warriors for this. I just thought the darker color of the Iron Warriors paint would work well with this darker gray. Just give it kind of a continue with this just more moody look to the model. And I just thinned this with a little bit of water and went in and painted it on around what I thought were frame parts and other parts that should be metallic. I was fairly conservative with my choices in terms of what should be metallics. There's a lot of leeway in how you interpret your models, and so I thought I would go with a more conservative metallic approach and leave a lot more of the model looking like it had been painted gray or some other colors that I'll add later. For the black details around the model, I decided to go with a Citadel Contrast paint, Black Templar. And I thinned this 1-to-1 with their contrast medium. My thinking here was that because I already had some dry brushing in place and all of the texturing and scratchiness on the surface, I could use the black Templar to let all of that shine through. That's how contrast paints work. So instead of painting it black and then having to go back and do it all again, I would just put this on and let that background coloring shine through. At least that was my plan. I also applied this on the knee armor. I had to be a little more careful here. When you're applying contrast paints over a larger surface, it helps to put on a good amount from your brush. Really load the brush up and put that on there, and try not to go back over the same area twice until it dries. I don't always succeed in that, but that's what I try to do. And then while it's still wet, I like to use my brush to just try and wick up a little bit of the excess that's pooled around there. I'd seen some pictures online that showed Horus Heresy Space Wolf's Dreadnought with red shoulder armor, and I thought that looked pretty cool. So again, working on the same theory that I wanted to let the previously applied applications of color show through, I went with another Citadel Contrast paint, this one being Blood Angels Red. And again, I thinned it with their contrast medium so that it would allow a little more of the color to shine through. And I just put this over both armor, shoulder armor areas. And by also having that contrast paint, it allowed me to see how thick the paint went on, how opaque it went on. And I could add later coats if I needed to, if I thought the opacity was too low. But it's a really good way of allowing the texture that you've applied underneath to show through. For the trim along the top of the armor areas, the shoulder armor areas, I wanted to have these have a gold look, but I wanted something a little warmer than just a bright gold. So I went with Balthazar gold here. It's more of a bronzy, brassy kind of look, but I think it looks good and kind of fits the mood of the rest of the model. And I just painted this on, thinned it down just a little bit with water, maybe 2 parts paint, 1 part water, and just put this on in a few thin coats to get good coverage. I wanted this to be completely opaque. I didn't want any of the previous texture or anything like that to show through. Now, once again, drawing on some pictures I'd seen online of other Dreadnoughts, I'd seen quite a few that they painted the figure's head helmet red, and I liked that. So I used corn red to base this, and I can't say that this is particularly driven by any narrative thinking or any lore thinking or anything like that. I just thought it looks cool. So sometimes I think the rule of cool is the best one to follow when you're painting your models. I like to. For the panel lining, I used a Citadel Contrast paint, Basilicanum Gray. I wanted to use this because it wasn't quite as stark as something like Nuln Oil or Black Templar, but it was still dark enough that it would give a very sharp definition and not impart a dirty look like Agrax Earthshade or a more brown panel lining would do. Contrast paints are really good for this. I didn't thin this one at all, though you certainly can with just a little bit of contrast medium, and it just helps them flow a little better. On the metallic parts, I used Nuln Oil. This is the new formula, but I just simply chose that one because it was closer at hand than the old formula. I like them both. But I just put this on very heavily so that it would really give it a dirty, oily look and also really bring out the details. I didn't worry about if it pooled up or gave any tide marks or anything like that. To me, that just represents weathering. I wanted to add a little pop of color to the model, so I went with this Lothern blue for part of the cabling. It's kind of a bright blue, but I thought it would really give it an interesting look and just add some color that the rest of the model was lacking, just something to catch the eye. For the other part of the cabling, I went with this Wild Rider Red, which I thought was also equally bright and intense, and would go along well with the Lothern blue. Does it seem a little out of place? Yeah, maybe. But I like putting these fun pops of color every now and then on a model that otherwise is a bit maybe grim and dark. I'd found some decals online that were supposed to be from the Horus Heresy era, so taking that word for it, I picked those up for not too much money, and I just put these on very, very simply like I normally do. I start by dipping my decals in warm water, and I just use this Mr. coffee warmer to keep the water warm, and it just makes them come off of the transfer sheet a little quicker and makes them a little easier to work with. So that's a handy thing that you can try with your own decals. Once I'd let that sit in the warm water for just a little bit, I put it on a piece of paper towel, and then I applied a little microset where I wanted the decal to go. This just prepares the surface. I didn't put down any gloss coat or anything like that. I just put this on, and it helps to hold the decal in place. Once I had the decal on, I lived dangerously and used the tip of my hobby knife to just position it just a little bit like I wanted. And I used a Q-tip just to work out any air bubbles that were behind the decal. And then finally, to make sure that everything was in place, I put on a generous coat of Solvacet. And this just softens the decal up, makes it snug down against the model. Once you put this on, leave it be, let it dry. Don't keep putting on continued applications or touch the decal. I wanted to add some edge highlighting to the metallic parts, the shiny metallic parts. So I used this Citadel Rune Lord brass to go in and just provide what I've heard described as chunky highlights along the edges of the trim, both here on the side and along the top of it. And this just gives it some reflectivity to make it look like it's a little brighter than it is, and gives it a little bit of depth and volume. Along the top of it, I went ahead and painted that all the way in. I thought I would just give that a nice bright look in contrast to the rest of it. Yes, I see the nub. No, I don't care at this point. Now for a brighter edge highlight, I used a 50-50 mix of the Rune Lord brass and Rune Fang steel, which is a silver color, and just thinned it down with a little bit of water and just ran this as a little tighter highlight around the sharp edges, the more prominent edges of these metallic parts. Just gives it a little more brightness. I wanted to increase the shadowing a little bit, so I used some Agrax Earthshade and just carefully lined that in around all of the raised areas, the bolt detail, anything that where two surfaces met, and I had a little bit of an area to guide my brush where I needed to apply this. Now, with a definite sense of irony in mind, I decided to base paint the eyes first in Lupercal green. I followed that with a coat of Sons of Horus green on about the front 3/4 of the eye area. Next was Sybarite green, and this was on about the front half of the eye. And then finally some Gauss Blaster green right up towards the front and just along the lower edge to kind of give the notion of some glow going on there. He looks a bit like an angry ant. Maybe he's angry because of the way I painted his eyes. The pipework on his mask was painted with lead belcher. Now I began to add layers to the helmet, starting off with Mephiston red, and I painted this on pretty much all of the forward-facing parts. I was going to leave the back of it in the corn red, the darker color, but I wanted this to be in the more prominent areas that would receive light. I also used this as a chance to kind of clean up right along the lower part of the eye so that any errors I made in painting the green on would be cleaned up. Once that was dry, I put on some Nuln oil, and this would just bring out all of the little details and the little things around the helmet. I didn't try and keep it too neat because I knew I could go back in and clean this up later. What I really wanted to do was just add some shadow. I started adding more of the Mephiston red back in just to brighten up those colors that I had darkened down with the Nuln oil. But I was a little more careful this time to make sure to avoid those shadowed areas and begin developing some lighting, some highlights, just really trying to bring out the contrast in the helmet. I began glazing on some Evil Sun Scarlet along the front of it just to try and add to the highlights and develop that in a bit of a gradient, going from the Mephiston red to pure Evil Sun Scarlet up on the front and top of the helmet. Also applied this around some of the other details around the ears and things like that. Just, again, trying to build just a little bit of contrast between the shadows and the highlights to bring out the volume of the shape a little better. And then I wanted to go in and just do a little bit of edge highlighting and just really bringing out a few more prominent highlights. And for this, I used Wild Rider Red and just carefully edged along that line there. You don't want to make this too thick or it goes from looking like edge highlighting to just big eyebrows. For the chipping, I wanted to do some sponge chipping, and I used Citadel Celestra Gray. I chose this because it would be a very high contrast color. I did not want to do a two-color chipping scheme, but rather just keep it very simple. Now, I generally, on a mecha like this, and on most models in general, I start at the lower part and consider that to be the area of my heaviest chipping. And then as I go up on the model, up on the mecha suit, then it's easier to compare and see, okay, how heavy did I do it there? Let me do it not quite as heavy as I go further up on the model. The idea being is that the lower areas are going to receive more wear and tear as you go along. Now on the upper areas, I do like to concentrate on edges that might get scraped or scuffed up, and bolt detail, things like that. Areas that maybe when somebody's servicing the vehicle that they might scrape across, or as explosions happen nearby, or it busts through buildings or knocks down walls or crushes trees or whatever it's going to be stomping around and doing. It might get some chipping there. But I'm being a little more selective in where I place them and just a lower volume than I did on the legs. Now the sponge chipping is more to just get it done quickly, and then I use a 2-0 liner brush to just do some scrapes and other kind of things like that in various places around the suit. I also use it to highlight the bolt detail, just to bring those out a little more. This is great for getting to areas that you weren't able to get to with a sponge, and just make larger areas of chipping that a sponge may not be able to do in scale appropriately. I wanted to add some weathering to the claw, and so I started off with this Citadel Runefang steel and just sponged on some of it along the lower edge. I wasn't really worried about being too precise here. I just wanted it to look like where there had been some scraping and scratching and things like that. Next, I stippled on some heavily thinned Scrag Brown from Citadel, and this just gave it a worn, slightly rusty, weathered appearance. I wanted it to look old. I really wasn't worried about does it look like rust, but I really was thinking more about I want it to be translated as old and worn out. That was more of what I was going for there. Now to brighten it up back up and to make it seem like there had been some fresh scratches that had gone down to the bare metal, I went back to my sponge and the Runefang steel just to brighten up the edges. Now using a brush, I employed the Runefang steel again, and this was just to go around and brighten up some of those bolt details and just to add various scratches and scrapes along all of the metallic areas, just to give them an appearance of being a little worn, a little used, and also just to brighten up some of those areas that would be receiving light, so there was a little bit of distinction, a little bit of contrast between light and shadow. Rockets have to be white colored, so instead of going with pure white, I went with this Ulthuan gray from Citadel and just gave it a good coating over each of them. This is a really good color as a base for white or for any other colors because it covers well, covers much better than white, but it's still very light, and the eye will read it as white if it's around, if there's very dark things around it. Now we used one of the newer Citadel shades to just deepen those recesses just a little bit. This is a shade called Soul Blight Gray, and that's really what it is. It's just a gray color, but it works really well over this light gray and gives it a little bit of a recessed shade, but not too much, and it doesn't stain everything around it too much, so it works really well. Now rockets also need to have a red tip, so I used Mephiston Red for this, and any areas that I got a little off center with my red, I just went back in with some of that Ulthuan gray and cleaned it up. Because it covers really well, it was actually able to cover up the mistakes I made in red very easily. Now it's time to start assembling everything, so I just started using my Tamiya extra thin cement and getting all of the parts glued on. I don't worry too much about scraping off the paint because the Tamiya extra thin actually dissolves the paint really well. And I go back and check everything after it's had time to dry, and anything that's not solid, I correct that, but for the most part, this works really well. I wanted to add some stains and some streaks around the model, so I used both Citadel's Known Oil and Agrax Earthshade. I thinned them both down very heavily with water, about 5 parts water, 1 part shade, and just went in and applied this with a liner brush, swapping out the colors in different areas. It gives the appearance of oil stains, grime, rain streaks, other fluids, just whatever you want. I mainly look for areas around the model, such as emanating from bolt detail, like if rain was leaving streaks there as things wash down. But then I also look for mechanical parts that might have oil leaks, that might have exhaust leaks, that might have anything that's going to come from the inside to the out and leave a stain. And sometimes I put stains in areas where there's not necessarily a logical reason for the stain, but maybe a mechanic is climbing around on it and spills some oil on it, or something drops from above, or another tank or something like that explodes and does parts everywhere. Whatever you want it to be, I just kind of go freeform here and just put it in to give some variety to the details on the surface and just make it look like a worn military vehicle. I think I'll go ahead and call this one done. What a fun model kit this has been to build. I have really enjoyed the assembly, the painting, the weathering, just all of it. There's so many greeblies and nooks and crannies and lumps and bumps that you can paint and weather. This is what I love about Warhammer 40K, and in this case, I guess Warhammer 30K, is there's something for everybody to build. Whether you like mecha, whether you like flyers, whether you like tanks, whether you like figures, there's something for everybody to build, and it's all quite varied and interesting, and just really fun to work with. So I'm very happy with how this turned out. I liked the way the contrast paints, the red contrast paints going over that modeled armor look. I like the way that came out. That's definitely something I'm going to be using more of, and I'm really liking those claws and how they came out. Every time I see these, I think of those little alien characters in Toy Story saying, "The claw, the claw." And I added, after I painted the eyes, I went back and just put in a wash of some fluorescent green paint from Vallejo, and I think that just kind of really helps them pop out. I like the way those look. But man, what a fun kit. I really enjoyed it. Now, if you're interested in how I did the base, there is a 2-part series on Patreon about that. And if you want to check that out, there'll be a couple of links down below in the description. And it will also show you what you get as a patron. And I would be most grateful if you would consider supporting the work that I do through Patreon. And of course, if you're already a Patreon supporter, thank you so much for the support you give to me and ultimately to my family. It's because of your support that I can afford to do the models that I do at the pace that I do, with the equipment and the materials that I do. We just otherwise wouldn't be able to afford it. I would certainly still model, but it would change the landscape of what I was able to tackle. So thank you very much for your support. And as I always like to do, I'll leave you with one final thought before I close. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.